Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk Assassin's Creed, your number one podcast for all things Assassin's Creed. In today's today's episode, get my words muddled up already. We're going to be taking a look at the Order of Ancients and history, which, by the topic name, doesn't sound very interesting. However, I am joined by Mr. Stainless, also known as Samuel, from
Nice to see
YouTube,
you.
who posted an amazing video which will be linked in my Twitter at the end of this episode, where he basically describes the Order of Ancients in history from a historian's point of view. But probably best you sum up your episode, buddy.
Yeah. I mean, how do you sum up something like that? It's in essence for me. I love kind of digging into the real life history behind a lot of the video games that we play, and Ubisoft and their games are brilliant for this. So one of the things that I was really intrigued by was, well, in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we're not in the ancient times, so to speak, anymore. So the Order of the Ancients doesn't really fit. But the Templars haven't been invented yet, if you can say that, really. So what on earth are they going to be? So I kind of used it as an excuse to sit down with a really well respected historian and kind of just ask them the questions. And it's kind of a video just having a conversation about that, really.
And after this episode goes live, the video will be in the Twitter, so I'd highly recommend you go watch it because I watched it and my mind is officially blown. And to sum up how my mind's blown, we're going to talk about the biggest thing that has ruined my life. Saint Patrick. It was discussed that he possibly might not be real. Please tell me more.
Yeah, well, I mean, so one of the big things that kind of came up, the historian that I was chatting to was a lovely guy called Dr. Jonathan Good, who is a historian at the Reinhardt University, and he had written a book about the cult of Saint George, who is the patron saint, pretty much. This could be, I mean, this is going to be an incredibly sweeping statement for somebody who's not from England, but Saint George is more or less the kind of patron saint of the epitome of Englishness, really. And he was the patron saint of crusading, and what kind of came up through that was that he may not have actually been real. And then of course that leans into, well, there's so many saints that are symbolic in our cultures, and St. Patrick is equally one of them. And what if he's not real as well? We do have slightly more historical basis regarding St. Patrick, that would prove that he did exist. He wasn't Irish, unfortunately, even though that he is kind of seen as being a very Irish symbol. From what I remember, he was English or Welsh, and then had been kidnapped by Vikings, and he came back and kicked the snakes out of Ireland, all that kind of stuff. That's even real. But yeah, one of the biggest things was that um, for us in the video, we were trying to draw a comparison between the Order of the Ancients. Could they be a saints cult, or a kind of cult that follows one of these saints? And St. George was kind of the easiest fit. But it was interesting to hear how such an iconic saint may not have actually been real, which was super bizarre.
Yeah, and it's literally blown my mind that I've just realised I called him Saint Patrick instead of Saint George.
But it's true for all of them. I think, it's there's a like I said, there's a lot of these iconic saints that our cultures kind of hold up, and especially for some saints, especially more modern day saints, we know they existed. There's historical basis for that, but especially for folks like St. George and St. Patrick, and people who go back to those times, it's harder, I guess, for us nowadays to actually, well, it's easier for us maybe nowadays to kind of poke and prod those things and be like, well, is this person real? Do we have any kind of log of where this person came from or what they did, or is it just something that has been fabricated in order to strike up fervor, which is of course a very Templar thing to do, I would say.
So, there's a lot of theories about how the Order of Ancients can crop up in
Mm-hmm.
Valhalla, and there is one about a cult of Mithras
Yes.
that a friend talked about. But after watching a video and how they could impact on history, I am starting to feel more that this idea of them taking a saint and becoming a cult that goes around them, especially something like St. George, seems more of a fit for the type of personality a Templar is. If St. George is something about crusading and we know that eventually the Templars do crusade,
Mm-hmm.
then this will be a perfect selling point. This is before they evolved into the Knights Templars, who started one of the crusades that eventually led into AC1.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and it's one of these things that it's one of the things that I love about kind of exploring random theories about these games, but it's also one of the the biggest disappointments when exploring these kinds of theories. In that, whenever, for instance, at the moment, I love the idea of the Order of the Ancients becoming a Saints cult, and I love the idea that the Pieces of Eden are actually Saints relics. But while that totally fits historically and it would be a really cool idea, I don't think that's where they're going to go. I think your friend is right, because we do see a glimpse of Mithra in the latest Assassin's Creed story trailer, who was an Iranian god, but actually was very prominent in the Roman Empire, managed to spread all the way to Great Britain as well. And I think they're most likely hinting that Mithra is somehow going to be involved, which is, I mean, I'm sure they'll do it in a really great way. But I do also kind of love that little idea that it would actually be a Saints cult, because you're right, it does totally fit in. It's a perfect bridging gap between where the Order of the Ancients were and where they're going, which is ultimately going to be where the Templars are.
Well, I've studied both the Cult of Mithras and your video, and I'm really becoming inclined is, what if they're both correct? I know it
Mm.
seems far-fetched, but England at this time is very divided.
Mm-hmm.
There will be a lot of people that still hold on to the pagan beliefs. There'll be a lot of people that hold on to the Christian beliefs, and of course there's the Norse that will hold on
Mm-hmm.
to their Danish beliefs. And it is entirely possible that a cult could set up base under the Cult of Mithras and follow, as it's described in my friend's Twitter thread. He does talk about the Father of Understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But cults have got to evolve to keep
Mm-hmm.
going. And if the cult wants to have a foothold in England, instead of going something that looks so pagan, so against Christianity, they could grow to something like St. George, which
Yeah.
strikes a heart with Christianity, and then people are going to not look at them as outsiders or I don't know what the word to call them, or pagans, but they're going to look at them as one of them. And that way, the Templars could then grow to operate in the light and start
Mm-hmm.
manipulating history. So, what if that's the direction they go, by uniting Cult of Mithras and St. George?
I think again, it's totally viable. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we St. George originally. Well, if we go on the knowledge that Dr. Jonathan Good kind of shared with us, St. George was apparently martyred in Asia Minor, which should have been kind of modern day Turkey. Which this is going to be it's a bit of a stretch, but we'll say it's a stone's throw away from the Holy Lands. It's quite a stone's throw. You would need quite a strong arm to reach that distance, but it's an interesting idea, and I think it is totally possible, because again, we're seeing that kind of Christian fervor, shall we say, really start to increase in the UK and in England at this time, where we have these Christian kings who are starting that kind of the strength that the Pope is starting to gather at this point on the run up to Crusades being announced. Which, I mean, the first Crusade that the Knights Templar were formed, I think it was less than 100 years, maybe just over that, from whenever Assassin's Creed Valhalla is set. So we're on the cusp of this boom of fanatical Christianity in Europe. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to kind of be like, okay, well, they have been following the cult of Mithra, but now we need some more socially acceptable form for this to take, and having it become a saints cult would totally fit that. I think the one of the other things I found really interesting, while doing all the research for this as well, was even how the assassins kind of get introduced to all of this. Because obviously we know the assassins are going to be introduced to Ivor, and we know that the assassins are obviously more Middle Eastern based, kind of around that Mediterranean area. We know that the Vikings have access to the Silk Road, so that was one possible way for them to do it. But we know as well that Vikings actually went to what was then the Byzantine Empire to become Varangian Guards. There's it's such an interesting time period for the connections of kind of that assassin mythos and the Templar ideals. There's so much that the developers could do, and so many things that they have to play with at their disposal with regards to history, and equally where they could even go from here. Because I think that idea that it's really exciting actually just thinking about it, that we have probably like the birth, what Assassin's Creed Valhalla has the opportunity to be is the kind of showing us the birth of the Templar Order and the run up to that. And they could equally do what they did with Assassin's Creed 2 with Brotherhood and Revelations, and expand upon that and really dive deep into how what happens in Valhalla turns into what we see in Assassin's Creed 1. And there's just so much that could be done. It's really fascinating.
And on the point of fascinating, this intrigued me quite a lot when I was working with AC Landmarks in last week's episode. We looked at a lot of information that Darby mentioned, and one of the bits that never made the episode is Darby mentions in the last Story Trail interview that this game will change the fate of the Order of Ancients and the Assassins, so change things are to come. And now, you mentioned St. George was martyred in Turkey, right? Now, sorry, we know that Basim is coming from Constantinople. We know that during this time, before the Story Trailer was introduced, there was talks of trade routes between different countries in England. And I think Constantinople type area was one of them. So it's not really much of a stretch to assume that information from this area has trickled to England through the assassins, and maybe someone betrays the assassins and gives the cult of Mithras crucial information to give them a stronghold, something that's going to make them stronger than the assassins.
Totally. I mean, there's so much crossover, and I think that it gives, I think, the Assassin's Creed franchise a lot of room to explore just in this one time period. Without, I know there's always a desire in the fan base for them to go to Russia or China or Japan and all these really fast. There's so many settings that they could do that, hands down, they'd all be great, right? But I think the idea that they could get 2 to 3 more games out of this one setting, because there is so much to explore. I think AC Landmarks, obviously, just want to say his content's amazing. I absolutely love reading his threads. I think the knowledge that he's sharing on Twitter is absolutely astounding. But he's absolutely right. I mean, the Byzantine Empire would have been, I don't think it's too much of a stretch for me to say this, probably would have been one of the superpowers of that time, for a time before they got almost completely obliterated. But I mean, the idea that the assassins are kind of traveling from Constantinople across through these other trade routes is really interesting to kind of see perhaps how the assassins stronghold gets formed as well, that we see in games like AC1.
And to be honest, it is so huge what they can do. And I think one of the biggest things you touched upon doing multiple games like they did with 2, and I think the reason that could work more than any other game is Viking culture is so Hollywoodized and TV distorted that everyone thinks it's barbaric, it's aggressive, but deep down they're farmers, they're traders, they're explorers. And using that knowledge, they could travel, spread the assassin message through trade, through growth. And I don't think that'd be too much of a stretch.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating, that whenever For Honor came out, which is another Ubisoft game, it feels like years ago. Well, it was years ago, but it feels like a long time ago now. Sat down with historians at that time as well. One of the reasons that people hated the Vikings so much in England was that they were actually really well kept and tidy and handsome. And the English nobles would have complained that they were all very well shard and smelled lovely, and that they were stealing their women. And it's strange when you juxtapose this very nice, handsome, almost like supermodel-esque view of a Viking, which was probably closer to the truth to what we actually portray them as on TV. It's interesting to see how the false truth is kind of permeated through history. But it equally from that, I mean, Vikings discovered America, North America, hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus did. They equally set foot on Iceland, on Greenland. You have North America. They traversed the globe. There's a lot that they could do, and equally Valhalla itself could kind of set the groundwork for a lot of Easter eggs that would lay reference to kind of other games in the franchise too. And what's good is that there is historical basis for kind of all of that because the Vikings spread out so far and achieved so much and traveled so far during their time. It's really interesting to see how they could push the boundaries of that and what they could explore.
So is it safe to assume, just out of theory crafting, that in Valhalla, Vikings are essentially a superpower? If the assassins controlled the Vikings, like Basim may be trying to do with Sigrid, they could spread the knowledge of assassins to further countries through, because Basim looks so happy that Sigrid is saying, let's go to England. So that's kind of like, well, this is us spreading us to England. But if the Templars got hold of the Vikings, they could manipulate to spread their seed. And then you just suddenly got this one faction that just wants to explore the world could become either the doom of the world or its salvation, depending on how you look at Assassins or Templars.
I think the Vikings definitely were not a superpower of their time, as much as I think we would all love to see them as a superpower of their time. The Vikings themselves definitely would not have been at least in my opinion, they would not have been a superpower of their time. One of the main reasons that they were kind of raiding and expanding out was because, one, their lands weren't fertile enough, and they sought out kind of more fertile lands to actually farm and grow into. The things that the Vikings had on their side, though, was that they were technologically advanced in really weird ways. And we see this crop up even in Irish history. It's going to sound weird, but if you look at their boat technology, they were able to kind of traverse much shallower waters than other cultures at the time, which led to them being able to deploy much further inland much quicker. And equally, it sounds bizarre, but the Viking axe was one of the most advanced weapon types of that time. And it sounds really strange because it's like, well, it's an axe. But what was beautiful about the Viking axe is that, one, it was dangerous because it's an axe and it's going to chop your limbs off, but it was also very, very practical. And King Brian Boru, who was one of the the greatest high kings of Ireland, this would have been a little bit later than the events that we see in AC Valhalla, but because they had settled in Dublin and other areas of Ireland at that time, King Brian basically wanted to unify his people in Ireland, and he saw the Vikings who lived in Ireland as among those people because they were choosing to live in Ireland, so they were going to be his people. He basically took the design of the Viking axe, mass produced it, gave it to his troops, and that was how they beat the Irish soldiers at that time, because they didn't need to have an axe and a sword, they just had an axe that could fit both purposes. So the Vikings weren't necessarily a superpower, but they were advanced in other ways that led them to go further to achieve other things that other cultures didn't. I think, they're a fascinating people, but I think what made the Templars so strong and so powerful was actually their alliance with the Catholic faith, because the Pope himself, the fact that one man can basically say to the entirety of Europe, hey, I want to go recapture Jerusalem, and if you don't help me, you're a bad Catholic. And everybody is jumping at the bit to prove how loyal they are. The amount of control that person has is astounding, which of course is going to draw the Templars into that. I think what makes the Vikings so fascinating to the assassin story is actually their curiosity and their their desire to kind of seek out new cultures and new fascinations. And I think that little kind of almost childlike curiosity is what makes them a great ally to the assassins.
But at the detriment, again, if a Viking decided to just want a bit more fun pillaging and raiding, if a few Templars were like, you know what, if you take us to this place and do as much pillaging as you want, the Templars may have a better idea of getting their message across. So
totally,
it kind of opens this window to, in Valhalla, it's not just going to be a simple assassin stop Templars, but we do maybe have this underlying issue that because of how technologically advanced you state Vikings were, they are kind of essential to maybe assassins learning a little bit more. Maybe if they know about this Vault of Isu and they can't get to it, they could use Viking technology for the boats to try and get there. Or maybe if the few just want to do a bit more raiding, the Templars can pay them a bit of gold, go sack a few countries, and they go along with it.
I think that's the thing. I think you're totally right. I mean, so the beautiful thing about Valhalla is that it isn't just black and white. There isn't just assassins and Templars. We've seen in the last story trailer that we're going to encounter the likes of Ivar the Boneless and the Sons of Ragnar, who are already in England. The way that they're kind of communicated in the trailer, they look like the bad guys. Because Ivar the Boneless just looks like if you met him in a dark alleyway, you would definitely want to run the other way, which is not really the hallmarks of, oh, this is a hero that you should be looking up to in the game. I think it's if we know the Templars at all, we know they're manipulative. I don't think it would be beyond their means and bounds to use certain Viking factions like Ivar to raid and pillage and sow chaos so that, like you say, they can kind of step in and be the heroes and be like, oh, look how great we are. You know, follow our faith, which is actually just step in line and do what we say so that we can kind of sow our power and strength further. So they're almost using that. They could be manipulating certain Viking factions to sow chaos so that they can come in and gain more control. And I think that's probably where Ivar goes against the pack there, because he is simply coming, I hope, just simply coming to England, not necessarily just to raid and pillage, but to actually just find a home. And he wants to live peacefully, which, with regards to an ethos, is much more, I guess, similar to the likes of the Assassins. So I think you're right. I think we could see a lot of manipulative things at work with regards to whether it's the cult of Mithras or the soon-to-be Templars kind of using Viking leaders to sow chaos so that they can come in and take control.
And it seems quite wild, to be honest. So, because a lot of the games have just had a black and white idea, you know. Odyssey, it was just trying to find lost family. Then you find out about the cults, and you kind of create a pseudo Templar order because of that. Origins, you're just going out avenging the loss of your son, and you create the Brotherhood. It is, all the games have been black and white from cause to effect, but Valhalla seems to have a lot more pieces at play that could either cause confusion or cause enough intrigue that you don't know where to look.
Yeah, well, I think that was one of the beautiful things about Assassin's Creed 1, which maybe perhaps we've lost to a certain degree as we've gone on. When we took down targets in Assassin's Creed 1, you know, whenever we received the mission, we were told about how, oh, you know, this guy's just bad. You know, he enslaves people, he murders people, he's an awful guy. And then we go out and we assassinate him. And whenever we have those little monologue moments where we're sitting kind of almost having that weird interview stage just before they completely die, there is that moment where they almost justify, you see a completely different side of them. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the characters that we assassinate in the game, they're just assholes. There's no way around it. You know, they can try their best to try and convince us otherwise, but they're just assholes. But for some of them, it's like, it's a complete perception issue where in some regards we're no better than the Templars because we're just following orders to just go out and kill people willy-nilly because of what somebody has said that they are. And sometimes these targets, shall we say, that we've been sent out to assassinate actually, in their eyes, have really valid means and they can make some really valid points. And I think it's getting back to that grey area where, look, just because this target that you've been sent after, you may have been told to go and assassinate them, but you're assassinating because they're getting in the way of your plans. What they may be doing is actually for, dare we say it, the greater good and all that kind of stuff. But it's not the assassin's version of the greater good, and that's always been the thing that's been interesting about Assassin's Creed, is that, and I could be wrong in this. This could spark some people off in the wrong way, but it's not that anybody's wrong. It's just that they're not. I get it. The truth that they're following is not your truth; it's their truth. But that doesn't mean that they're entirely wrong, and it doesn't mean that you're entirely right in doing what you do. It's a very interesting kind of gray area, which is for me kind of where Assassin's Creed always sat, which was quite interesting.
Well, they always say everything is permitted and nothing is true and everything's permitted. So if nothing is true, then how are the Templars wrong? And if everything's permitted, then why aren't the Templars allowed to do what they want to do?
Yeah.
It's a grey area.
It's one of those things where, I mean, we love the Assassins, don't get me wrong, but they are, and in some ways, always a walking contradiction. And in some ways, they're no better than the Templars. But that's probably a much larger a much larger debate for a much different time. But yeah.
Well, there is something that's come up that I kind of pieced together from your video, and I like it to be the last topic of this episode. Somebody on AC Landmark's thread called Jeffrey, he posted a theory that he on a YouTube called the AC Gamer, and basically it's a theory about how we might have to assassinate Alfred. And the idea of assassinating Alfred is probably a bit, well, we don't know. But AC Landmark's made a point that his death is unknown. So I came up with an idea, and this is because of your video. Yeah, it's because of the mad one. So what if the cult of Mithras needs to get that foothold? They want England, they need the power. They've copied this idea of St. George, and they've gone to, we're going to have him as our patron saint, we're going to adopt a cross, like the cross of Christ, we're going to become Christian, it's how we work. And they want to take Aelfred's throne. They want Aelfred up, because Aelfred at the time is trying to unite England, and is quite prominent. And maybe Aelfred's too weak from illness, as we know he was ill. So what if he tasks Eivor to kill him? Because Aelfred knows that he can't stop this new cult of Mithras. How it's become now is too powerful. But by him killing Aelfred, it kind of leaves the country in a little bit of uncertainty, meaning that the Templars can't get the throne so easily. But this means Eivor has to then go into the shadows to join the Assassins full time to try and unite England. Which then causes...
Yeah, I mean, it's not outside the realms of possibility. And that's almost what we could say about any theory when it comes to Assassin's Creed, is that, I mean, it's totally possible. It just depends it always depends on what the developers want to do, which is always kind of the sticking point, is whenever, like what we said at the start, is whenever we come up with ideas that we think are way more interesting, and then the developers go in a completely different direction. You're like, oh, I like my idea more. I mean, it could be one of those things where a similar situation that we had in Odyssey, where we almost have, if they call it Mithras, almost choose Aelfred as this kind of chosen one symbol, and that's how they get taken out. Could it be that Aelfred's a sage, and they're killed in that way? There's so many directions that they could go, and they could go in all of them and or none of them, which is always the intriguing thing. I worry that Valhalla, whenever kind of the Mithras symbology kind of got brought up in the trailer, I worried that there wouldn't be any form of kind of Christian cult-like symbols being brought in, and I hope they do lean into it, because I think it would be such a brilliant fit, especially with, you know, some of the saints either being sages or being pieces of Eden with the relics, because it's such an easy comparison, and it's things that we've seen in the past. With regards to the cult of Mithras, it's personally, I wonder whether I think that's where they're going to draw the the kind of comparison and how they draw that link between what has happened in Odyssey and what we see now in Valhalla. Because Mithras and her followers kind of, although she was kind of formed in Iran and she's an Iranian goddess, she does have very deep Greek and Roman ties. So it's part of me wonders whether her introduction into the storyline is simply to kind of tie things up between, oh hey, you've played Odyssey, this is how Odyssey now links into Valhalla. If that's what it was for, I think I don't mind if they don't tie together. But yeah, if that's what it's for, I'd be a little bit disappointed. And I hope that we see some kind of Christian cults in there, just because I think it could be really awesome.
I think it's kind of hard to say, as you said, because we know our developers have their own freedom.
Oh, totally.
But we need to, I think a lot of people need to look at as well, quite clearly, that when Valhalla was dropped and we got the first trailer and we got the first big deep dive from the devs of talking about the game, one thing that was brought up a bit, and it's now gone underwater, no one really talks about it, is they want to tie up every loose end. Essentially, this game is going to end everything from 1 to Valhalla. And that means we do have to be prepared for some things that are just going to tie in. And now, it would be a very unique tie-in to say, look, your actions in Odyssey created the following that become the Cult of Mithras.
Yeah.
But for the Templars to become the Templars with the cross, which I know the cross comes from Cain originally, who is a figurehead in Christianity, that to get them to become that Christianity style figurehead is soon to become in the Crusade, we need Valhalla. And maybe Valhalla they convert from Cult of Mithras to a cult that follows a saint, as you suggested. I'm very spearheading on this idea that they're going to follow a saint, because I could see them converting to Christianity, seeing as at the time some Norses were converted to Christianity. So I could see them tying AC1 that way.
I mean, totally. And it's one of those things where, I mean, the Order of the Ancients, all of these kind of antagonists, these enemy type characters that we see in the Assassin's Creed games, they always just go to whoever holds power. So the Cult of Mithras at this point is, from what I've seen, is losing ground. They're not really as strong and as popular as they used to be, but Christianity is on the rise and Catholicism is on the rise. So hey, let's just go for a rebrand from Mithras to Catholicism, and hey presto, okay, yeah, you change Mithras for Catholicism, sure, yeah, whatever, give us more money, kind of thing, you know. So it's totally doable, and I think that's what it's unfortunate to see there not be. There has been worry, obviously, among the community that that game's not being hyped up enough, and there's not enough promo and stuff. But for one, I'm super excited. I think narratively, there's a lot that could come out of Valhalla, and I think it's one of those games that has the potential to, whether you're a long-time fan of the series or somebody that's just jumped in the past couple of games, I think it has the potential to be really special. Hopefully, while also trying not to hype it up too much so that we're not disappointed. But I think it could be really great.
I think it's the marketing for it is perfect on the grounds of a lot of games have this trailer and then a mission that you all get to play and you all get to watch it, and every 500 YouTubers show this one mission. And when you get to that mission in game, it's like, well, it's not good because I know it. I've seen every possible outcome. I know the enemy pattern. And I know we've seen a bit about the Raidenberg's castle, finding King Oswald alive. But that's the extent they've gone for. There's no more knowledge of what we're going to expect. And it leaves this, you get the game and everything's going to feel new because not every YouTuber's gone over it 1,000 times.
Totally agree.
Well, I think that's all we got time for tonight. That was longer than expected. Yikes. I want to thank you everybody for tuning in. I would highly advise you check out the video that's linked because I was blown away by it and I still am, and I'm probably not going to shut up with the idea that Cult of Mithras could follow St. George.
I mean,
If-
I think if enough of us say it, they're going to introduce it, right? That's how it works.
I think so. Should I start a hashtag trend, guys? Hashtag Saint George is a Templar. We'll see
There we
how it
go.
goes.
We'll definitely
So,
not get in trouble.
no, just like die. Be like, can you please take that down? We don't want you spoiling the game. Oh, thank you for spoiling it for me. Right, so thank you all for following me, guys. Check in the description for a link to Mr. Stainless's channel, so pop on by. To hear this, of course, I was going to say it now. To hear this episode 3 days early, there's always a Patreon, so if you're on the Patreon followers, you know you can hear episodes 3 days early. Otherwise, I will catch you all next week.